We understand everybody's anxieties is up. To have watched the video that we watched as his uncle was disturbing, to say the least. And we're asking everybody to be their better selves. We can't destroy our own communities. We want to continue to protest and get justice without destroying our own communities.
Yet another unarmed black man was shot in the back by police, this time just outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Friends say Jacob Blake was breaking up a fight when police arrived. While the details are still emerging, a 20-second cell phone video shows Blake heading back to his car, and he was shot 8 times in the back by police while his children sat in the back seat. Closer to home, the Ontario Human Rights Commission released a scathing report painting a picture of the country's largest municipal police force in Canada as racist. I'm Maggie John. Even though Black people make up less than 10% of the population in Canada's largest city of Toronto, the Ontario Human Rights Commission interim report reveals that Black people are more likely to be arrested, charged, overcharged, struck, and killed by Toronto police officers. Ina Chadha is the interim chief commissioner who joins me now to discuss the report. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ina.
Hello, Maggie.
The report's being called a disparate impact. Can you elaborate on the meaning of this?
Yes, the name of the report is a disparate impact, and it references the disturbing catalog of the different ways that Black people in Toronto are subject to the disproportionate burden of law enforcement. The report contains some very deeply troubling findings that Black people are more likely to be arrested, charged, overcharged, struck, and shot by Toronto police.
Now, the collective impact of the, which was the first report that the Ontario Human Rights Commission released in 2018, revealed those same things, that Black people are more likely to be fatally shot and so forth by Toronto police. Would you say things have changed really since the second report?
The collective impact was released in December 2018, so it hasn't been a long time. I think I would say you'd have to ask the Toronto police for the answer to that question. From our perspective, no. We would say that that was the first report that gave us a very disturbing glimpse into the racism or racial bias experienced by Black communities in their encounters with the police. The collective impact documented the egregious interactions. It was locating the research in SIU data. So that was data that where individuals were experiencing serious use of force by police that resulted in hospitalization, extreme injury, or death. And so a disparate impact does a deeper dive and drills into other types of interactions with police. And so what we now know is that even in the everyday encounters with the police, where their low-level use of force, the racial, anti-Black racial bias is a manifest dynamic at play and has an extremely grossly disproportionate impact on Black people in Toronto.
I mean, when I look at the statistics that are in this current report, 32% of cases involving police firearm. This is, again, Toronto, or Black people in Toronto. 36% of cases involving police use of pepper spray. Again, over 45% involving police taser use. Would you say that it's dangerous to be a Black person today in Toronto?
A collective impact documented that a Black person was nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be a victim of a fatal shooting by the Toronto police. I think that's your answer, and that was documented back in 2018. Now we know through a disparate impact that 40% of lower level use of force, that means being struck, kicked, bruised, lacerations, the use of dogs for intimidation, those are the types of interactions that are being were examined in a disparate impact. And so we know Black communities are almost 40% likely to be subject to those experiences. So I'll leave that to you to determine if those disproportionalities cause you to fear for people's safety.
And especially Black people who are in mental distress. Of course, we know the story of Regis Korzynski Paquette, even more recently, Jamal Francique and DeAndre Campbell. I know that the report didn't go in much detail about mental illness and wellness calls, but that seems to be an arising issue, not just in Toronto, but across the country when it comes to the interaction with police and people in the Black community. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, in fact, the report did look at different types of factors, and it included the factor of mental health. And what it determined is that myth that we have of an armed, violent Black man who has a history of criminal tendencies, all of that's been debunked. Mm-hmm. And that myth is in fact an urban myth. And it does not exist. The factors of mental health, the factor of mental health is a very serious implicating factor that the report does examine. And so we do know now that often the individual is unarmed, the individual has little to no criminal history, and in fact it may be experiencing mental health crises. And that is an issue that the report touches on.
How did the Ontario Human Rights Commission gather this information?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it's very important for the public to understand that the Commission did, and our researchers did, a lot of heavy lifting here. This was not data that was just handed over to us by the Toronto Police Services Board. This was data that the Commission had to retain preeminent scholar Dr. Scott Wortley, a criminologist, and his research team and the Commission's research team of legal people worked together to triangulate 3 different types of reports. They had to manually pull 3 different types of reports to track the data and cross-reference, because, as I told you about the low-level use of force, that is not documented by the Toronto Police on the basis of race. So what we had to do, or the Commission and our researchers had to do, was manually work backwards with those reports to track race. And that took many months of hours and hours of labor in order to come up with the data set. And this data set is quite clear and convincing with respect to the disproportionate impact on Black community members in Toronto.
What I thought it was fascinating that some of the statistics about racial bias shown towards Black women, while as we talked about, we all know the disproportionate amount of anti-racism or hate that is shown towards Black men charged by police. There were some startling numbers about how Black women are treated by the Toronto Police. Can you delve into that a little bit more?
You mentioned that Black community members constitute less than 10% of our Toronto population. And yes, we know that Black men represent 4% of the Toronto population, but they are subject to about 1/3 of the charges of police. When it comes to women, the same disproportionalities are at play, if not even significantly more in certain areas. So while I can tell you that women are 4 times, Black women are 4 times greater than white women to be the victims of lower level use of force. The charge rate for Black women is almost 3 times, 2.5 times higher than white women. So those disproportionalities are replicated with respect to gender as well. And really important that you point that out, that gender is again a complicating factor.
Yeah. Something else that I also found fascinating too, Ina, was that despite Black people being charged disproportionately higher, cases involving Black people are less likely to result in a conviction than those involving white people. Can you expand on that?
So that is a very troubling trend, that what we know is 1/3 of all charges are charges against Black community members. And during the study period, what we determined were Black people were grossly overrepresented when it came to the withdrawal of charges. So that could be a withdrawal, it could be a dismissal, it could be an acquittal. And when it comes to acquittals, of all acquittals, 60% of acquittals. So that means this person has gone through the judicial system, and a court of law has determined that the person needs to be acquitted. 60% of those are Black community members of acquittals. So why is that? Why do 20% of convictions not result in a conviction? That suggests a couple of things. It suggests that Black community members are being overcharged. it signals that they are being subject to low quality of charges, meaning weak charges. And it also suggests or signals hyper surveillance of police of Black community members. So Black people are being watched and monitored such that in compared to other racialized group or white people would not be caught doing the same low level alleged criminal action. So it is a very troubling part of the report, the overcharging and the acquittal rates.
So a day after the Ontario Human Rights Commission releases this report, the Toronto Police Services Board releases their own 81 recommendations for police reform. And you were very vocal about not being very happy with how this was done. Expand on that.
Well, I am pleased that the Toronto Police Services Board, the Toronto Police, and the City of Toronto are finally acknowledging the phenomena of racial profiling and finally confronting systemic racism and in particular anti-Black bias. But that acknowledgement is not enough. They've now released a report and they've released 81 recommendations. What they didn't do in doing that work is they didn't consult with human rights experts, but more importantly, they did not consult with Black community organizations and community members about those recommendations. How do we know that those recommendations will service the very community that they're supposedly created for? Most importantly, from the Commission's perspective, is that there are no tangible accountability or enforcement mechanisms tied to those recommendations. It's ad hoc. We, as the Commission, call for action from the Toronto Police Service, Toronto Police Service Board, and the City and the province for accountability mechanisms. And that's what I was most disappointed about. I was disappointed that we've consistently engaged with the Toronto Police Service Board, and we've paid them the respect of involving them every step of the way to ensure that our work is legitimate and credible and as a real reflection of what is happening with policing practices. But unfortunately, as I said on that day, I did not feel that we were paid the same courtesy was reciprocated, because had they checked with us, we would have talked about some very specific things. We are seeking legally enforceable and binding mechanisms. We want mechanisms that are independently monitored. We're looking for specific actions that are sustainable and are measurable. We know this report will just be another report on a shelf collecting dust if there are no measurable deadlines, timelines, frameworks to determine if the recommendations work. And so,
can you share what some of those calls to action are that you've put into the report?
Well, let me just start with the first thing that I think is missing here, as I said, with the Toronto Police Service, and that is inclusive engagement with Black community members to tell us what priorities are the ones that they want the Toronto Police Service Board to work on. So our call to action with the Toronto Police Service, first and foremost, relates to consulting with Black organizations and community members and the Commission. And it also calls on legally binding mechanisms. With respect to the province, there's an urgent need now. We are at a point in our world where we're at a crisis level with these issues, and there's an urgent need for police accountability, for transparent accountability mechanisms, for investigating and disciplining police officers, and for mandating de-escalation. Those are some of the things that we are asking from the Toronto Police Service and the province to work with us, strategically work with us to amend provincial regulations in these areas.
I did notice that defunding the police is not one of your recommendations, and that's something that many groups within the community have been crying out for. What are your thoughts on that?
We have called for transformative change. We've called for transformative change with respect to police practices, with respect to police culture, with respect to police regulation, and province-wide change. And so whether or not that includes defunding or reallocation, those are questions that we need to continue to work on. The Commission has always taken a very research-based approach to issues. And so this isn't something that we have studied comprehensively yet. but I think our calls for action address many of the substantive components that underlie the community's call for defunding.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ina Chadha, again, the Interim Chief Commissioner for the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for your interest in our work at the Commission.